Hello, and welcome again to a Beatles program, a weekly talk show podcast, which is called Things We Said Today. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the three regular co-hosts of the show. You may also know me from my other Beatles program, which is a syndicated radio show on the Beatles called Every Little Thing, and also from my website, kenmichaelsradio.com. And I'm being joined by my two regular co-hosts. First of all, the leading man when it comes to Beatle news on the internet for decades now, and he writes for Variety and Billboard and Access.com, a whole bunch of websites and publications, and that's Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And we also have our resident musicologist who wrote for the New York Times in their classical department for many years, was their Beatle guy at the New York Times, and he's also authored a few Beatle books. Got That Something? How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Changed Everything, and also The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop. And that's our very own Alan Kozin. Hi, Alan.
Hello, Ken. Hello, everyone.
On today's show, our main topic is going to be the Beatles' BBC recordings, but we're going to be a little bit more specific when we talk about these BBC recordings and performances, because we're going to try to focus mainly on 36 songs. And those are the songs that the Beatles did for BBC Radio that they didn't release for EMI Parlophone. But before we talk about that, we have a few news items, as usual, to get to. One of which broke a couple of days ago, and that concerns a new John Lennon stamp coming out, which we heard about quite a while back, but now we have a definitive date for it. It's September the 7th, and this is the John Lennon Forever stamp. It's part of their Music Icons commemorative series, and from what I've been reading, the stamps are coming out in a pane of 16, and with the stamp pane design, it resembles that of a 45 sleeve, which is pretty cool. You think about it. And each horizontal row is supposed to have different gradients of color, and there are supposed to be 4 different stamp varieties. No doubt appealing to all the Beatle collectors out there. And so the photo of John on the front, it says, is from the Walls and Bridges period, of course, taken by Bob Gruen. That was in August of 1974. And I've also read that there's an image of John on the reverse of the pane. That's familiar to all of us. It's a black and white photo taken of John with a white piano at the time to promote his Imagine album. So are we excited about this? I'm really, I love collecting some of these commemorative stamps. Steve?
Well, I remember the excitement that everybody had over the Yellow Submarine stamp a few years ago. So, but this is actually, I think, a little cooler. By the way, the black and white photo was taken by Peter Fordham. So, but yeah, this is really exciting, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens the first day of issue, and if you're going to be able to find these things right away. Probably not. I mean, I would think there's going to be a lot of people after this.
And to get 4 versions too.
I think you usually send away for a first day cover or something like that, right?
Right.
I think
you can.
Yeah. I think.
But
that's
I think
what I would do.
It looks from the picture, and I'm looking at the press release on the USPS.com site. It's going to all be sold together.
Oh,
so that's the way it looks. I mean, that's the way it looks to me. And then you just punch them out. That's, again, I mean, we don't have one in hand, and it doesn't say that. Here's what it says in the press release. It says, for the first time, the Postal Service is revealing the full pane for these stamps, featuring a photograph of John Lennon taken by Bob Gruen. I'm scanning down here. It says, you're right, it has different gradations, and it says Lennon's signature appears at the top of the stamps. USA, the peace symbol, and the Forever denomination appear along the bottom. My guess is that you'll buy the whole thing. That's my guess. I can't see them selling them separately, at least not that way.
All right. Well, I'm going to check with my local post office, see what they know. Usually they don't know much about these things, but
right.
I'll see if I can find out more information
but
about it.
The design seems to indicate that they're not going to break it up for customers. I mean, they have generic forever stamps, so I can't imagine that they would sell these separately. But I don't know.
Well, we'll see about that.
We will see.
All right, Steve, you had some news about a new book on Ringo coming out?
Kevin Roach, who's done books on George Harrison, John, I believe he's done George, John, and Paul. He's done books on their backgrounds in Liverpool and their family, their family trees and all this stuff, is doing one on Ringo. And the book is available for pre-order, he said. So you should be able to find, if you look up on Amazon under Kevin Roach, you should be able to find it. Actually, I could probably do that right now while we're sitting here. But yeah, and the books are his past books. I think you guys have seen his past books, and they are very well researched and detailed. So this will be a good buy. Mm-hmm. This will be a good buy. So,
all right. You also had something there, Steve, about a quote from Ron Howard that is regarding the new Star Wars movie.
Right. Ron Howard, who directs the new Han Solo prequel in the Star Wars, continuing number of Star Wars movies that seem to come out every 3 months, was talking in an interview about directing Star Wars, and he compared it to directing 8 days a week, the Beatles touring years. He said, the level of anticipation, talking about the Star Wars film, is unlike anything I've done. You fall into it, and it's amazing. It was a little bit like the Beatles documentary that I took on. I could tell from the moment it was announced, Ron, don't mess this up. So I immediately felt the same thing with this. The fans care, and they should care.
Mm-hmm.
Which is real. I mean, which probably is even more true with Star Wars than it is with the Beatles. But
why would you say that?
Because I think there's probably more Star Wars fans nowadays, given that we're talking across multitudes of generations. Culturally, I think Star Wars has a bigger impact on everyone than the Beatles do at the moment. That's not to say the Beatles don't have an impact, but I think given the Star Wars franchise and all the products you see in the stores and all that stuff, I think Star Wars is huge. There's no getting around that.
Yeah, it's an amazing dynasty.
Yes,
and who would have thought when it started that it would be lasting all these years? And it's to their credit for all the work that's been done on them.
Well, I have like I said, my comment about movies coming out every 3 months. I think they used to be big events. They're not as big events as they were. At least I think so. I mean, I did not see Rogue One until just a couple of months ago because I watched it on DVD. I haven't been to the theater since Force Awakens, so I haven't seen. My son is gone, but I haven't. I'll wait for them on DVD. So,
all right. Well, you do know that there's so many Beatle fans that are fussy about everything that comes out. So,
oh yes, I do.
It's very similar to Star Wars there. So,
that's true too.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. So,
okay. Also, Alan, you wanted to talk about a musician that just passed away named Matt Marks.
Right. Matt Marks's connection to the Beatles world is that he did an arrangement, an orchestration of Revolution 9, probably the only cover version. Well, probably some other people have probably done weird cover versions that weren't quite, but Matt Marks's was an orchestration of the piece as it actually is, and he got all the details in there for live orchestra. Matt was he was a French horn player and a composer, and he first turned up as a member of this new music orchestra called Alarm Will Sound, and that's who he did the Revolution Number 9 arrangement for. Also arranged things by Aphex Twin, which they put out an album of Aphex Twin stuff orchestrated. Aphex Twin is an electronica guy. And The Revolution 9, I've seen them play live a couple of times, and after the first time they played it live, I managed to get a tape of it, and when I was teaching criticism at NYU, I used to play it for my class every year, along with the Beatles track, which, shockingly, a number of these grad students at NYU had never heard. But a lot of them also hadn't heard I Am the Walrus. Yes, it was really shocking. But, I would play them both versions and have them write something about, what they felt. And most of them felt, as, I have to say I do, that, the Beatles version is obviously the preferable one. But there's something really astonishing about what he did to bring the thing to life in a way that could be played. And, when they played it, they had fun with it. You've got players walking around with their musicians going up to the mic saying, the Watusi, the twist, all of that. And I had posted a clip of it. There's a clip of a live performance on YouTube. You can find it if you look up Alarm Will Sound Revolution 9. Possibly also Matt Marks. But yeah, Matt was, 38 years old, died of a heart attack. He was, for anyone into the sort of younger end of the classical new music world, he was someone everyone knew, everyone loved. He was a very funny guy, very sweet guy. I spoke to him a few times, at concerts or at this thing called the New Music Gathering, which he was a founder of. It was sort of a big new music festival and symposium every year. And I sent him some outtakes of, the acetate of the unreleased mix of Revolution 9, since he seemed to be interested. And but by then he had already made his arrangements, so it wasn't going to have any effect on what he did, but he was kind of keen on having it. And I gotta say, he did that at least 10 or 12 years ago, so he would have been like in his early 20s, and I kind of found it very heartening that a composer in his early 20s would be fascinated enough with Revolution number 9 to want to make an orchestral arrangement of it. So,
did you ask him why that particular piece he wanted to work on?
I probably did, and I can't remember what he said. He just was fascinated with it, and and Alarm Will Sound used it as part of a sort of a stage play that they put together, in which the premise of the play was that John Lennon and Karlheinz Stockhausen were supposed to meet at some point in 1969. The play is called, I think, 1969, and even though Revolution 9 is a little bit earlier than 1969, they wanted to include that. The whole premise of the thing, I ended up writing a piece about the stage thing because it was going to have its premiere, and I already knew the Revolution number 9, which had been around for a few years earlier. And so I looked into it, and it turns out that the entire thing was based on a misunderstanding that Stockhausen's assistant had about whether this meeting was supposed to take place, because, the Stockhausen world, it sounded, like an interesting rumor, and it might be kind of cool, and Stockhausen's on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, and McCartney used to mention him in interviews around 1966 when he was going through his own avant-garde period. But, to anyone who knows sort of the details of what the Beatles were up to in 1969, the idea of Stockhausen and Lennon meeting and then Stockhausen and the Beatles doing something together was like, that was not real. So, but it was an interesting fantasy, and it got that piece onto the stage, so why not?
Wow. I know that the group The Fab Four have done the entire White Album live, and they do Revolution number 9, but I haven't seen them do the show, so I don't know what exactly they do to it. I would imagine a lot of the Beatles recording is probably piped in to the keyboards.
Yeah, Fish does the whole live album, White Album live too. And if I remember correctly, what they did for Revolution 9 was just sort of a bunch of random noise. It wasn't really a serious evocation of the piece.
But Marx did it. Marx did it note for note. That was what was really nice about that. And I had never heard it before you posted it, Alan, and I thought it was amazing. I really did. I couldn't believe it.
There is also a studio recording of it that Alarm Will Sound did on an album called Modernism that came out just a couple of years ago.
Okay.
All right. I have one other news item. I don't know. Do you guys have anything else?
No.
I had sent the two of you a link for this because I didn't know if the two of you were aware of this album that Keely Smith made. This was back in 1964. Keely Smith is really known as being a great pop and jazz singer. She was married to Louis Prima. They made a lot of hit records in the 50s, and she went on to have a solo career. But she made this album called Keely Smith Sings, the John Lennon-Paul McCartney Songbook. And apparently it did very well in the UK. And according to the record label, which is Real Gone Music, that's the same record company, by the way, that just reissued Harry Nilsson's Pussycats. But they say on their website that what makes this significant is that it's listed as being the first of its kind when a respected pop singer tackled Beatles songs. And at a time when the Beatles were still new, and the establishment, the traditional establishment, were either not ready to give the Beatles their due respect, or they were waiting to see if they were going to be a flash in the pan. Keely Smith risked being ridiculed for either being too hip for her peers or being too square for the young teenagers. So it's now available. It's been reissued after being out of print for quite a while. Again, it's called Keely Smith Sings, the John Lennon-Paul McCartney Songbook. Did you guys know about this album?
I did not.
I did not. I mean, I'd never heard of it before. Yeah, I have to admit I'm not a big Keely Smith fan, but no, I had not heard of it. I'm going to look at the cover and see if the cover looks somewhat familiar. There it is. No, the cover doesn't look familiar either. It says it's available for pre-order and it'll be released June 1st.
Oh, okay.
But the MP3s are available now.
Mm-hmm.
So the digital has already been released, but the rest of it won't come out until June 1st, the actual CD. So
okay.
Interesting.
Any other news?
Nope.
All right, then. Let's go to our main topic of discussion, which are the Beatles' BBC recordings, but more specifically, these 36 songs that the Beatles did for BBC Radio, which they never released for EMI. And for me personally, although the BBC recordings are just fascinating to listen to, what drew me to the BBC recordings, first of all, were all these other songs. Because what's more alluring than hearing songs that the Beatles never released? And early on, when this stuff was bootlegged, it was so exciting, and I loved the two double CDs that came out officially, although they don't have all 36 of these songs. But I have a lot of things to say about it, but I think maybe I should let you guys talk about these songs, and in general, what the BBC performances mean to you. And why don't we go to Alan first?
Okay. What they mean to me in general? Well, you know, as you said, really, it sort of seriously expands our view of what they played and how they played it. I mean, a lot of these are songs that we know, you know, from Chuck Berry and, you know, various other people. And so the songs themselves weren't familiar, but then hearing the Beatles do a song that you know that you never heard them do before is always really a kick. I kind of wish that EMI had gotten them out a bit earlier. I mean, by the time they brought out their official ones, I think we had all heard them on bootleg many, 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 many times. And there are still, you know, not everything is out. I kind of wish that EMI would do a comprehensive, or EMI Universal, Apple, whatever the hell, would do a comprehensive set of all the BBC recordings, or all the the ones that are known to still exist, which are out there for collectors. I mean, they're sort of shooting themselves in the foot by not serving the market that can get them elsewhere if Apple doesn't give it to them. The other interesting thing about it for me is that there are a number of songs like Hippie Hippie Shake. Not an incredible song, really. I mean, I can't say that I'm really sorry that they never recorded it for EMI, but they did it, quite a number of times on the BBC. And, even things like, Sweet Little 16, which they didn't do too many times, but they did it in close succession on a couple of BBC shows, that were sort of near each other. You kind of wonder whether it was whether these things were tracks they were considering recording for EMI. I mean, they didn't even attempt them, or we would know. But there has to be a reason. Yeah. I'm just thinking there has to be a reason that they did them so much, the ones that they repeated over and over. I mean, there were other things like Soldier of Love and Carol and Clarabella and Lend Me Your Comb and That's All Right Mama, all of which appeared on one show that they only did the once, and I'll Be On My Way, I mean, you kind of get the impression with I'll Be On My Way, which is the only original that is among the 36 that weren't done for EMI. You kind of have the impression that they performed it at the BBC mainly to make a demo, to give to Billy J or something.
It was perfect just the way it was.
Yeah, that could easily have been released as an EMI track. I don't know why they never took that into the studio themselves.
Yeah, so many of these songs, these 36 songs, they could have released for EMI. But, things were happening so rapidly for the band, and they were progressing and evolving so quickly. And so, really, by the time 1965 came around, you only have a few covers. Mm-hmm. So, thankfully, they did all these songs. And what to me is kind of remarkable is that, 1963, which I really wish there'd be a documentary just on that one year, because that was the big breakout year for the Beatles in the UK, and they were so busy day to day, and they did so much on BBC Radio. And so many of these songs, like we said, there's 36 altogether they didn't release, they could have just as easily just played songs from their albums.
They could have, yeah.
I mean, the primary purpose is to promote your work. So, and they certainly played enough from their albums, but they probably felt, well, we've done Please Please Me enough, or certain songs, but let's give the fans something else to listen to. So, and even going into 1964, I remember saying that the fact that they did I Forgot to Remember to Forget, the fact that they did any song in 1964 that wasn't on their albums is remarkable. They didn't have to do that. Yeah. They could have just promoted their albums or their singles, and that's it.
Yeah, and by 64, I mean, it's not as if they were still playing these in concert either. Early on, it was a mix of what they were doing in concert and, what they were working on. But, as you go further into the Beatles era, when they were putting out records, we have recordings of a lot of shows from 63 on. And they don't have, Three Cool Cats and Hippie Hippie Shake and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting that, they continue doing them in the BBC. I really wonder what they had in mind, when they were doing it. Because they probably weren't thinking, this wasn't a time when you were thinking of, you were going into the BBC and that will give us a record of our performance, Things weren't archived, and so they weren't doing it for any expectation that they were laying down a permanent record of this repertory. And
so we have to be grateful that we have these recordings at all. And this was really based on a combination of some of their engineers taking home copies and fans lifting it off the radio. So... Steve, what are your thoughts about these 36 songs or the BBC performances in general?
Well, first to get to the BBC performances in general, I mean, when I first encountered them, which was at a record store in my area, and looking at the names of the songs, it was almost hard to believe, because we in America didn't know anything about the BBC tracks at the time. It was hard to believe that that these weren't fake. I mean, that was kind of the first thought that I had. I mean, is this real? And then when you heard them, obviously, they weren't fake. They were real. And then what they brought on was an understanding that the Beatles weren't just Meet the Beatles or the stuff that we were seeing in America. There was a lot more to them. So, I mean, they really expanded our knowledge of the group. As far as the songs go, I mean, there's some real winners here. I mean, I have a couple that, to this day, I was absolutely thrilled to hear the first time out because they were just so darn good. There are others that I would probably never care to hear again. One of them is "I'll Be on My Way," which I really don't think is a great song.
You're kidding.
I mean, not "I'll Be on." Yeah, "I'll Be on My Way." No, I don't particularly like that.
Really?
But anyway, I mean, there's just some of these are fantastic. I was listening to, I think it was I forgot to remember to forget. The lyrics on that are just wonderful. Have you ever looked at the lyrics to that? They're just, and I was listening to George sing it today, and it's great. The lyrics on that are just tremendous. But there are other great songs. It's funny, on one of the tracks when they're singing Lucille, Brian Matthews goes, "And now a tribute to the Everly Brothers." Well, even though the Everly Brothers did it, that's not who it was a tribute to. That was kind of funny. "Beautiful Dreamer," by the way, is on the BBC sets.
Yeah, it's on the second one.
Right.
On air.
But I mean, there's some great stuff here, and it's great to hear them do, like, "Johnny Be Good," Carol. I think my all-time favorite of all of them is "Soldier of Love." I absolutely adore "Soldier of Love." Every time when I remember picking up the bootleg vinyl, and it was on Contraband Music, as I recall, and it just had the name stamped across the front. And I remember seeing it and going, "Really? They're going to do this?" And sure enough, you open the album and listen to it, and it was in tremendous quality. And John, you could almost picture John, doing his little hunched over thing like you saw on the cartoon show, doing this. I mean, it to this day, that still sticks out. It's a great song. But I mean, there were a lot of good songs. Like you guys are saying, some of this stuff comes from their live shows. Some of it doesn't, and I guess that's kind of weird that some of it doesn't. But Clarabella is another one that I really like. That's another real favorite that stands out from their BBC stuff. But yeah, I mean, this is just all great stuff. I mean, I think we've actually discussed this in the past, but
not specifically just the 36.
No, not specifically the 36. I mean, but Clarabella is another one I love, and that made me hunt down that song and Soldier of Love, what the BBC sessions did is it made you hunt down those real deep songs like Clarabella and Soldier of Love that you'd never heard before.
You mean hunt down the originals?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hippie Hippie Shake is another one. I mean, they did that a lot, and they absolutely loved that one. And by the way, talking about Hippie Hippie Shake, when I interviewed Chad Romero a few years ago, he said he hoped he would get to sing the song with Paul McCartney. That has never happened, to my knowledge. I'm sure we would have heard about it, but he's always hoped that he could sing the song with McCartney. So,
there was a concert that Paul gave in England. I think it was in Liverpool a few years ago, and he opened the concert with Hippie Hippie Shake.
I think that was Anfield, I believe. That was Anfield.
It's just nice to see that he brought that one back.
Right. And it's too bad he doesn't dig some of these songs up just for the hell of it. I think he did that for the home folks, is what he did.
Hmm.
And it was a nice gesture. But yeah, that was very cool. I do remember that. But I mean, there's just I think that's the real treasure of the BBC stuff, is that you get a further look into, who the Beatles were, what the Beatles were. And also for American audiences, it opened up a whole new a whole new world almost that we didn't know about. I mean, we thought the Beatles were Meet the Beatles, Beatles' second album, and we found out some of their heritage that way through the BBC stuff,
Well,
and the Hamburg stuff. Go ahead.
from an American perspective, where we were getting only 12 tracks on an album, that's 3 albums worth of stuff.
That's
Right.
right.
A lot.
Right.
And to me, they could have released any of them. I mean, they were polished enough on these recordings where they could have gone into EMI and done them and nailed them, as they
Right.
did all the covers. I mean, one of the things that I love about the BBC recordings in general, not just these, but also their own originals too, is that you hear how great they became as a live band. There was some polish to them and a certain level of spontaneity at the same time.
Mhm.
Because you really get to learn how great and quickly they progressed as a live group. And, I've often made mention of, you compare the Beatles' Decca Audition recordings to the Please Please Me album, and it's like night and day. And that's like, a year apart,
Mhm.
really. And then, since so many of these recordings, not all of them, but many of them came from 1963, you know that they played many of these songs live. They really learned the parts really well. You got to hear how each of them progressed as musicians. I mean, some of my favorite moments in listening to these recordings, and their originals too, is hearing George Harrison progress as a guitarist.
Mhm.
I mean, there's some great lead guitar work on songs like Too Much Monkey Business. I love Sweet Little 16, that version that's on Live at the BBC, the first collection. Some Other Guy, Sure to Fall, different styles of playing from George, and you got to witness this. We're kind of lucky in a way that with most bands, certainly bands today, by the time they have a record contract, they're kind of already polished and ready. With these recordings, we can hear them progress as a young group of musicians before our eyes, and it's kind of like watching your family grow up in a way. So when you've got something like the Decca recordings, and then you hear what they sounded like on these recordings, you can see how much they advanced as a band.
Mhm. It's too bad that we don't have a lot more BBC recordings from everybody. I mean, there are some really great BBC recordings that have circulated, among collectors, and unfortunately, not all of them have been released. I can think of over the years, I've heard some Animals stuff that's really good. The Rolling Stones stuff, which they just released, they altered it, but they just released it finally. I mean, that stuff's been out among collectors for years. I recently heard some Manfred Mann stuff that was really good. There's all sorts of stuff out there, and it's too bad. I guess it's a rights thing that more of that stuff hasn't been released. One point I was going to make, though, about the Beatles stuff is that it's really a shame. Alan, you said they waited so long. It's too bad they had to go to the wall almost to put these things out and use bootlegs and radio tapes and all that stuff, because some of this stuff really sounds tinny. Some of the EMI released versions sound really tinny, and it's really too bad that they didn't have better quality stuff for all that. I mean, some of it does sound really good, and for the EMI stuff, they did dig out what they could.
Yeah,
but they don't have have everything.
There was one other source that they were able to use. Should we go back maybe and talk a little bit about the sources for the stuff?
Sure.
Which have changed a lot over the years. When Kevin Howlett put together the first Beatles at the Beeb radio special, and it was 1982, I think, he went into the archives to get his hands on a bunch of the stuff that, and he knew what he was looking for, because by then Mark Lewison had already written his 2-part piece in Beatles Monthly cataloging all of the sessions. And what he found was basically zilch. The tapes had been wiped, and they just kept the paperwork, but they didn't keep the recordings, or at least so it seemed. And in fact, when the first EMI set came out, I went to the press conference I think it was one of the Hard Rocks in New York, and there was a video link up to Kevin Howlett in London where they, the press interviewed him, and I remember someone asking the question, so when you walked into the vault, was it like going into King Tut's tomb? And, Kevin had already by then told me the story about there not being anything there. And he said, what we did was we took out an ad in the BBC Listener and said, basically, those shows that we always tell you that you shouldn't be taping? Well, if you happen to have taped some of these, maybe you could let us borrow your tapes. And that's, how they were able to get that first radio program together, in addition to some bootlegs. And if you collected bootlegs at that point, you could hear certain tracks where certain audio quirks of a specific bootleg were very audible. You knew exactly which bootleg they got it from. But that's what they were down to. They had to use tapes they got from listeners and bootlegs mainly. There were a couple of discs of shows, like, pressed discs, and they were able to use that, and that was good quality. So when Kevin was asked, was it like walking into King Tut's tomb, he didn't lie about it, but he also didn't say that he found nothing, because, it probably at that point was sort of impolitic to do that. So he just sort of talked around it. And yet, if you look up the articles from the time the first set was released, there are a number of journalists who just wrote a direct quote attributed to Howlett saying, "It was like King Tut's tomb when I walked in there." But what they also found, probably before the first EMI BBC set, and certainly I think more so after, is two things. They found some of the BBC engineers had taken tapes home. And that's why, for instance, you have that "I Feel Fine" outtakes, with the talking in between. I mean, that's because that's the session tape. The other thing that I guess Kevin hadn't thought about when he first put the show together was that apart from the actual programs the Beatles appeared on, Saturday Club and Teenager's Turn and Here We Go and all the Pop Go the Beatles and From Us to You shows, what the BBC used to do is put together a series called Top of the Pops for foreign use. And the Top of the Pops shows were not actual shows in the sense that, people would come in on Saturday morning to be on Saturday Club and they do the broadcast and that was it. What they would do is they would take the tapes from all those shows of the previous few weeks and they would cut together a show for Top of the Pops with new intros and outros, and, the music was the same music that you heard on Saturday Club, etc. Those things were pressed as LPs and sent all over the world to the BBC's various outposts. And once they got serious about looking for this stuff, they were able to reconstruct an awful lot of it from the Top of the Pops discs. And that's why we're also now seeing so many other 1960s groups. Because, those original tapes were wiped too, but the Top of the Pops shows are out there. And, in fact, every now and then you run into a disc, a broadcast disc being auctioned or put up on eBay or something like that. It doesn't always have Beatles on it, but those things are there.
Yeah, and you can also tell that the remaster that came out a few years ago, to me anyway, to my ears, I think it was a noticeable improvement over the 1994 release.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I've also noticed that there are certain songs like Soldier of Love where towards the end, of the song, it sounds like there's a drop in the level of the volume. I don't know if you picked up on that. So there are a few songs that are like that.
I don't recall
others where there was one where they sort of looped a drum intro, and I mean, it sounds obviously looped. I can't remember which one it is, but yeah. And another thing that they did that I, wholeheartedly disapprove of is that in some of the dialogue they edited out a line here or there, so
right.
that, you still need the bootlegs for a lot of the stuff. I mean, if you want to hear it as it was broadcast, that's where you have to go, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Right.
I also wanted to mention, since I talked about George Harrison before and hearing his lead guitar work on these recordings, there's some exciting drumming from Ringo on some of these recordings. And in particular, Ooh My Soul, some of the faster ones, like that one, and I'm Going to Sit Right Down and Cry Over You, is exciting to hear. He's kind of all over the place on the drums on that one. So like I said, it's interesting to really study this stuff and hear they're improving as musicians, as time goes on.
Yeah.
So
Ringo was a great live drummer early on. I mean, once they couldn't hear themselves and knew that nobody else could hear them, he sort of got a little lazy, as they all did. But, you look at the Washington Coliseum concert and you listen to these BBC tracks, and which are basically live recordings, and, he's absolutely there. It's true.
Yeah. And kind of like one of the things that we're fascinated by as we studied the Beatles is that when they did cover songs, they did cover some familiar songs, some Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly and people like that. But at the same time, they also like to find B-sides and lesser-known hits. Like we used to always talk about Devil in Her Heart. That's a really obscure song when you get down to it. But to do a song like, and actually this was a top 20 hit in America, but I'll bet a lot of Beatle fans later on, as they're discovering this, didn't know the song, would be I Just Don't Understand. I mean, what an odd choice for the group to do. And I love the fact that they would mix familiar with obscure or relatively obscure.
And the Honeymoon song. The Honeymoon song's a weirdo, too. I mean,
right.
Yeah, there were a bunch
and
of those.
especially when you're talking about it, I Just Don't Understand, especially who did that. And Margaret, I mean, that's as off the wall as you can, kind of off the wall as you can get, And Honeymoon Song, the same thing. I mean, that's an exceptionally off the wall song, and the fact that he gave it to Mary Hopkin later. So, I mean, he obviously loved it.
So the fact that these were songs that the Beatles were listening to, that alone is an interesting, part of their history to study why we study the BBC stuff. A song like So How Come No One Loves Me, which we wouldn't even know most likely here in the U.S. for the Everly Brothers. Just to know that the Beatles were discovering these songs, and these were the ones that interested them for some reason, I find that fascinating. And also knowing, if you go back to the first two sessions they did for BBC Radio, while they still had Pete Best, they did Dream Baby, the Roy Orbison song. And the Beatles never covered Roy Orbison.
Otherwise, Otherwise, yeah. Yeah. Obviously, that was a kind of a salute to Roy, obviously. So.
Let's talk about those first two sessions, because EMI has released nothing from those first two sessions, and they exist. They're not in stellar sound quality, but you can hear them, and they are obviously super historic sessions. I mean, especially that first Teenager's Turn, March 7th, 1962, hadn't been signed by anybody. They'd failed at Decca. They were still being shopped around by Brian. And you've got Dream Baby, Memphis, and Please Mr. Postman, which that performance of Please Mr. Postman was apparently, according to, I believe, Mark Lewison's book, the first time a Tamla Motown song was played on the BBC. And it was the Beatles doing it. And, I mean, that to me is, it may strike a lot of people as a footnote, but to me that's major.
Mm-hmm.
And so that,
to know that they recognize Motown,
Yeah, and that they were the first, an unsigned band from the north of England, were the first ones to come to London and play a Motown Tamla song on the BBC. I think that's an incredibly important thing. And so that, forget about the sound quality, Apple. Just put that out. It is a piece of history that should be out there for people to hear.
Yeah, I think it was Kevin Howlett that said, and he might have said this when you and I interviewed him, Steve. It proved that the Beatles were great talent scouts. The fact that they could pick out a song like Please Mr. Postman and look at how legendary the whole Motown label has become in their whole history. So, and also in that second session, they did A Picture of You, which was a Joe Brown song.
Right.
And, Joe became good friends with the Beatles.
Right.
And closed the concert for George.
Right.
And and they did the Roy Orbison song before they toured with Roy Orbison.
Right.
So, I just find it interesting that they were discovering this music somehow. It's not as if all this music were major hits on BBC Radio.
Right.
So
they have plenty of music left out of those sessions that they could put out a third CD. Easily.
Yeah.
EMI, are you listening?
And also there are outtakes that were never broadcast, like Sheila and
right.
Three Cool Cats, but I mean they did it other times and we have them doing it. And we have Sheila from Hamburg. But would be nice.
It'd be nice to have a studio. Yeah.
Yeah.
A studio recording of that. Yeah. And also there's a few songs that they did for the BBC that they also did for Decca. And you can hear the difference in how much they progressed from there. A song like Memphis, for example, or Till There Was You. Yeah. And I must say that, first of all, you mentioned Soldier of Love, Steve. On my live show for Every Little Thing, that is the most requested of all the BBC recordings. So a lot of fans recognize that, that was just a great song and a great recording of it. But To Know Her Is to Love Her is one of my favorites of all these recordings because I'm a sucker for great harmonies. And, they really nailed it on their BBC performance of that. So
I want to bring Clarabella back up again. Where does that stand on your list, Ken, as far as popularity with requests?
I never get a request for that song.
Really?
Never.
Because I think that's a great song. I do. Partially because the Beatles never touched it any other time, but I think it's a great song. Alan?
Yeah, I think it is in the spirit of Paul's Little Richard type things. It's another one of those. It would be interesting if you could put out at least a side of Paul doing Little Richard stuff.
Oh yeah.
And that
sure
would be sort of interesting. And have John doing Chuck Berry on the other side. Make it a double album. Have George do Carl Perkins. There's probably enough stuff to sustain that, just about. You might have to skip away from Carl Perkins and go to Elvis for I forgot to remember to forget and bring in Paul's That's All Right Mama. But you could get Morris Levy to put out, the Beatles Sing Roots.
Oh boy. Oh my God. Uh-oh.
Yeah. Since I mentioned the Decca audition, To Know Her Is to Love Her, compare that to the BBC. It's like night and day, or Crying, Waiting, Hoping, for that matter. So, yeah, I mean, this is a treasure trove to me of great material. And, I'm glad that those 2 volumes did come out, but there could easily be a third. But it would have to be almost all songs, their original songs, so...
Yeah, I would want them to, instead of doing a third, I'd want them to just go through and put out the tapes complete and chronological. No comments edited out, no stuff looped, any of that kind of stuff. Just put out the set. They could get the best one now is put out by someone who calls himself for this purpose Lord Wreath. And he put out something like, I think it was like a 27-disc set. Now, there were repeats because, for instance, he had a couple of discs of the Saturday Club 5th birthday show on which the Beatles appeared, but he's got the complete shows, and then I think the Beatles part alone is elsewhere in the set. And there are a couple of repeated things, that make sense in the context of what he's presenting. But he's presenting absolutely everything, and I think it included a DVD of some BBC TV stuff too. You know what? I mean, I know probably for a fact that he wouldn't mind if EMI just took his set, pressed it up, and put it out, because it's the best quality of all the tracks that are available at this point, and it's what a serious collector would want, in that it's chronological and as complete as we can get our hands on. It's known that there are other BBC tapes out there that have not been bootlegged and have not been trading with people, that collectors are just sort of holding back. It would be great if those could be liberated too, but it'll happen probably eventually.
And somebody, and because as a cheaper priced alternative to the full set, EMI could put out, say, a double disc set with full shows on each side, or 2 full shows on each side, actually, because some of them are pretty short. So,
all right, good suggestions. It also is worth noting that there's certain songs that the Beatles did for BBC Radio that they never did live of their own material. So it makes it more worth your while to check out. Even if they're very close to the studio recordings, certain songs like I Should Have Known Better, I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, I Call Your Name, which is interesting because John messes up the lyrics. Also, apparently they did record Hello Little Girl for one of the broadcasts. Actually, it was supposed to be the first one with Pete Best, but that was never broadcast.
That's a pity.
There's also the fact that actually once they did a song completely differently, and that was when John sang Honey Don't twice in 63 and 64. And that brings up the whole question of, why they did that and what led them to give it to Ringo. So
I think it was just that Ringo didn't have anything to sing on Beatles for Sale, so he took that one over.
Right.
Yeah. There are some other interesting little anomalies among, this isn't one of the 36, but Hard Day's Night. When they recorded it for the BBC, I guess it was shortly after they had finished the studio recording. And as you'll recall, the studio recording has George Harrison and George Martin playing the solo together, and I think that was one where they half-speeded it, right? George... eventually, by the summer of 64, he was out playing the solo live, and it was perfectly fine, but he had not at that point mastered it at full speed. And so when they recorded it for the BBC, they recorded it without the solo originally. And I have a version of it that just sort of goes along without the solo. It's, but for at least one of the broadcasts, it may have been broadcast that way once and possibly on Top of the Pops, but for the broadcast of the show that it was on, which was what? Can't remember. Saturday Club from...
Hard Day's Night was only on Top Gear and From Us to You.
Okay, so when they recorded it for, I think, From Us to You, what they did is they took the studio solo and they edited it in. If you listen to the BBC track of that, you can hear that edit if you are listening closely. But there's also a version without the edit and without the solo at all.
Okay.
Since you mentioned From Us to You, we should also mention that is another one that they changed because it wasn't. I mean, they took From Me to You and changed it. So.
Well, that's just because that was the name of the show.
Right, but I mean, when we're talking about revising songs, like or revisions of songs, that goes along with that. So
and we also did that medley for Christmas.
The Christmas medley, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And those things don't usually count in the 36, do they?
No, not at all.
So there's really 38.
Yeah, but they don't count, Alan.
Right.
So it's just the 36. Okay.
But they should count because it's the Beatles. The same with when they sang the side-by-side theme. I think if they're on it, we should add it to stuff that should be considered a Beatles recording.
Right.
They're not full, complete songs.
That's true.
But anyway, and one other thing that we do mention from time to time that's interesting about the BBC recordings is how many lead vocals we got from George Harrison, which certainly was to change for the records for the albums for EMI. But that apparently came from Brian Epstein, at least from what we've read from what Mark Lewison has written, because I think that it made the Beatles even more appealing and more saleable, to have 3 lead vocalists on their songs. And so, it's unique alone to have 2, but to have 3. And that's why with the Decca Audition recordings, you had a bit more of George than you would expect. So you can see the same thing happening here with the live performances, especially from 1963. And there's so many great rockabilly songs. I mean, we talk about Carl Perkins and all, but Nothing Shaken is one of my favorite of the BBC performances right there. I should also bring up I Got a Woman. What a great recording that is, and when you listen to the double disc of Live at the BBC, that's the first of the unreleased songs. It's just such a great opening song of those. It's just electric. It really was captured so well, performed so well. So many great performances on here. Definitely.
I think we should also mention that, for anybody that wants more information, obviously the Howlett books, especially the last one, are the place to go for information, along with Mark Lewison's book. But the Howlett book, concentrates on that completely. I mean, it's readily available. I don't have the blue version. I noticed the blue version is going for like $150. There's no difference in the blue version, right? Either of you guys have that blue version?
No.
Yeah, I don't. I didn't bother to get it either, but it's going for a huge amount of money on Amazon, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. But there's also 2 earlier versions of Howlett's books. He did the really, really thin Beatles at the Bee 62 to 65. That came out. God, I mean, I remember that years and years ago. I'm trying to look at the copyright here. It says first published in 82. And then there was an upgraded version, a little expanded version called The Beatles at the BBC, the radio years 62 to 70, that has more information, but not nearly, that came out in 96, but not nearly the stuff that the box set has. And that has, memorabilia, replicas and all that stuff. And that is really, if you really have to have all the information there is, that's the place to get it.
The first one, the paperback, if you're really collecting everything, is also available in a hardcover Period Press edition. Or not available. It was available.
Was available.
It's out there, probably on eBay somewhere.
All right. Okay. Anything else you guys want to add about the BBC performances?
Give us more.
Well, EMI, if you're listening, or Universal,
or Apple.
We'd love to see more of this, or Apple. All right, then. So why don't we just give all of our folks listening our contact information, beginning with you, Steve?
My email address is BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I have a Beatles News and Information news group where I post all sorts of Beatles news. As far as the show is concerned, you can write to us with all your comments, questions, money, whatever, CDs at Things We Said Today radio show at gmail.com. There's a Facebook page, Things We Said Today Beatles Radio Fans. There's a second Facebook page, Things We Said Today, for the Fab 4 radio broadcasts. They broadcast our show on the weekends. Thank you, Matt. And they also broadcast Ken's show.
Yes, which is on
yes.
right before Things We Said Today on Sunday nights at 11.
Thanks to Michael Lynch, who I'm sure is listening. Michael, we don't mention your name enough. Thank you for composing the wonderful theme song to our show. What have I left out? Oh, we're on YouTube, we're on Podbean, and somebody just, Harold Lepidus, who did our Dylan Beatles show a while back, cued me into the fact that Podbean has an app. And I've known about the app, but I haven't really used it. But I downloaded it this week and used it, and it also streams the show. So it's very easy to use. So if you're looking for another source of streaming besides YouTube, the Podbean app will do the trick. Plus, we're all over the place. A lot of programs that pick up shows like ours will have our show. So there we go.
Okay.
Of course, if you're listening to it now, you already know how to listen to it.
That's right.
Alan, how about you?
You can reach me through Facebook, either at Alan Cozen or Alan Cozen Remixed, and I'm having a contest, which is, if you guess what it is, you win.
Very good, Alan.
That's very Yoko-ish.
Yeah.
It is.
Wow.
That's good.
We should let her know about that. And as for me, Ken Michaels, you can reach me at my email address, which is everylittlething at att.net. My website is kenmichaelsradio.com. Don't forget, every single week you can visit my Beatles trivia and games page and win one of 9 great prizes every single week. And I just did an interview with another Beatles author, Jerry Hammack, who's written a couple of books so far. There'll be 4 in total, called The Beatles Recording Reference Manual. It really explains the whole recording process of what the Beatles were involved with. And that interview can now be found on my Interviews Page 4 page, which is the same one that has all my recent ones with Jude Kessler and Jimmy Webb, Brian Ray, The Weaklings, Neil Innes. They're all there on that page. And I just want to make a quick mention that on June the 9th, I will be one of the MCs for the Beatle Festival that takes place every year in Connecticut. It's called the Fab 4 Music Festival. And that'll be happening at the Oakdale Theater in Wallingford on June the 9th. And there's 20 acts altogether from New York and New England, all Beatles tribute bands playing Beatles and solo. And there's 10 acts that perform indoors, 10 acts that perform outdoors.